Hi, my name is Simon Thompson. I'm at UCL and I am studying the Beowulf manuscript, the Nowell Codex, and thinking about how it might have been received in the early 11th century. I'd like to express my thanks to John, Jane, and Richard, who have permitted me to present remotely in this way, as I couldn't be with you, and to apologise to all of you for what is quite a strange and hopefully a not too dull method of receiving a paper. I'm going to be talking about what I've called capital indications, by which I mean how Scribe A thought readers should engage with the Nowell Codex purely through looking at his usage of capitals. So, in more detail, what I'm intending to do is to suggest or to think about whether and how capitals may have helped to shape meaning for readers in the early 11th century. More specifically, I think it's fairly clear that there is an element of scribal choice in where to use minor capitals. So wherever we stand on the question of scribal shaping, scribal editing, scribal rewriting of literary works in the Anglo-Saxon period, I think there is certainly a degree of scribal choice in where to use minor capitals in what they have produced. And in this particular manuscript, there seem to be some passages that Scribe A is highlighting for his readers' attention through his use of minor capitals. In thinking about this particular manuscript presentation of these texts and what it means, I'm following Donald Scragg, who has argued, and I quote, that what happens to a text is just as interesting ultimately as where it came from. That is, I'm not making an argument here about the exemplars used to produce Beowulf and the other texts in my manuscript. I'm making an argument about how they are being used, how they are being deployed in the early 11th century. And I'm fairly clearly also tapping into or trying to be part of the discussions led by people like Nick Doane and Roy Liutzer and Bernard Muir about scribes and what they do with their Old English poetry, to what extent they are shapers or editors or poets in their own right. Very recently, Francis Newton has argued that the student, this is a quotation, the student of manuscripts must always be open to the possibility of form and artistry, and that's what I want to be thinking about today. The form and artistry that seems to be present in the scribe's reproduction of his texts. So the Nowell Codex has the shelf mark of the second half of London British Library manuscript Cotton Vitellius A15. It's more commonly known as the Beowulf manuscript. I'm not very keen on that term because it tends to overshadow the other four texts that are there with Beowulf, and I prefer the term the Nowell Codex because it's a bit more impartial. It's named for Lawrence Nowell, the first known owner, who signed what is now the first page in 1563. The manuscript comprises 5 texts. The first 3 are prose. So there's a prose translation of the Passion of St. Christopher, the dog-headed saint. That's missing its beginning. There's Wonders of the East, which is illustrated throughout with what have generally been described as quite crude paintings. Then there's a translation of the Epistla Alexandri, the letter of Alexander the Great to his tutor Aristotle and to his mother and sisters. And then there's Beowulf, which we all, of course, know and love. And then lastly there's Judith, which is also missing its opening. The first 4 texts were copied by Scribe A, who broke off about 2/3 of the way through Beowulf, midway through a verse. Scribe B took over, completing Beowulf and writing Judith. I don't think they wrote through in that sequence, and that's probably not how the texts were originally arranged, but that is how they stand now, and that's the easiest way of thinking about it for the purposes of this presentation. I'm going to be talking exclusively about Scribe A because it's easier to focus on one scribe's practice. But what I think is worth noting is Joseph Claygraff's argument from 1988 that the Beowulf manuscript, the Nowell Codex, is particularly useful for thinking about scribal activity because we have a poem that 2 different scribes are working on, so we can try to identify their different practices in relation to the exemplar text of Beowulf. And we have different texts worked on by the same scribe, so we can see whether the scribe is consistent throughout them, in which case we can assume that it's his personality, his style that is being expressed, or we can see whether he changes his preferences through his texts, in which case we can assume that he's trying to faithfully reproduce what's in his exemplar. So he calls the Nowell Codex a constellation of texts and scribes, and I'm trying to treat it in that way, by comparing what Scribe A does in his different texts, and comparing what Scribe A and Scribe B do with Beowulf, trying to identify what freedom, what thoughts Scribe A has about his work. So let's start thinking about capitals. Capitals are certainly used, and we all know this, to start texts off in Old English. This is the most famous instance in the Nowell Codex. This is the opening of Beowulf, where a line of capitals is used to show that we're starting a new text. A similar technique is used at the start of Alexander, to a slightly lesser degree at the start of Wonders of the East. Capitals are used in a less dramatic way to mark sections throughout all of the texts. So this is a page from Wonders of the East and then a page from St. Christopher. And you can see that we have capitals in the margin there, what I call marginal or major capitals, following Crap and Dobby in the definitions of them. They're not in the names. What I call marginal or major capitals to indicate sectional divisions. And editors generally follow what scribes have done in the Beowulf manuscript to show sections. Throughout Beowulf, that's most well known as being the fit divisions or sectional divisions. There's one little moment in St. Christopher, though, where the marginal capitals are too frequent to really be sectional divisions, and editors don't generally use these as sectional divisions because they're too frequent. The first two of those are far too short to be sections proper. And I think it's very interesting that this sudden use of three marginal capitals in close proximity to one another, the densest use of marginal capitals in the whole manuscript, is at the most dramatic moment of the Passion of St. Christopher, where the saint is tied up and the king, Dagnus, has ordered arrows to be shot at him in order to kill him, perhaps, or as part of his tortures, and the arrows stand still in mid-air throughout the day, and then suddenly, towards the end of the day, they turn round and fly at the king, blinding him. An interesting parallel to that is found in a Blickling Holomy, where Garganus is blinded by his own arrows. But this very dramatic moment seems to be highlighted by those marginal capitals, maybe making it more exciting, maybe inviting the person reading it out to take it more slowly, to pause, to emphasise. I don't think these are necessarily scribal choice, because I think marginal capitals, as I go on to explain, seem more likely to be defined by the exemplar than minor capitals. But I think this is an example of marginal capitals being used not to clarify, not to sort out obscurity, not to make it easier to understand a text, but making a text more exciting, using an interpretive form, in a shaping and an editing form, rather than just in a clarifying one. But as well as those marginal capitals, this is the real meat of what I'm talking about, is the minor capitals that are littered through the text. You can see a slightly blurry minor capital C there. Now, other people have argued that where minor capitals are used, they might sometimes be indicative of meaning. So, Beowulf, as we know, as most names are in Old English manuscripts, is usually spelt with a lowercase initial b. But there is one instance, these are both by Scribe B, there is one instance where Scribe B uses a capital initial B for the spelling of the name, and this is one of the places where Scribe B copies it with an I rather than E as the first vowel. And Kevin Kiernan has argued that this is Scribe B acknowledging that he's made a mistake in the spelling of Beowulf with an E, using a capital B to reassure the reader and say, yep, this is the correct spelling, this is the one that we should be following. He hasn't generally been followed, and he doesn't produce a similar argument for Scribe A's use of initial capitals for Wealhtheow at line 1215 or Hrothgar at line 1840. But that is his argument for the use of initial B there. Dobby felt that the use of minor capitals through Beowulf was absolutely random and completely unclear, but I think it's worth noting this instance and Kiernan's interpretation of it, just to bear in mind that other people are thinking too that initial capitals, minor capitals, can be used to communicate between scribes and readers. So thinking in a comparative form, I've argued elsewhere that major capitals remain consistent through Beowulf. So Scribe A and Scribe B on the left and right here respectively, you can see that their minuscule hands are completely different, or very different, but their use of their form of marginal capital G is pretty much the same. Obviously they're slightly different in execution, but the basic shape, the concept of the shape is the same. So comparing those two would suggest, or I would suggest, that indicates that they are copying both the placement and perhaps the shape, the model of their capital from their exemplar, rather than coming up with it themselves. Throughout St. Christopher, Scribe A uses a similar kind of slightly decorative capital O, marginal capital O, but then in his other text, in Wonders and in Beowulf, he uses completely different forms of capital O. So this evidence together, following Claygraph's idea, shows that Scribe A and Scribe B use the same initial capital shapes when they're copying the same text, but the Scribe A varies his initial capital shape when he's copying different texts. And that indicates that initial capitals, the major or marginal capitals, seem to be coming from the exemplar rather than coming from the scribe. Just to back that up numerically, there's a lot of numbers that I'll throw at you here, but I just want to highlight a couple of them. And if you want a copy of this in more detail, then feel free to email me. My address will be up at the end. We can see that the use of major capitals and the use of minor capitals is quite different by Scribe A and Scribe B. That is, just to rush through this and to highlight some of the numbers, when we look at Beowulf Scribe A, we can see that he uses about 0.3 major capitals per page, and Scribe B, copying the same texts, uses about 0.25 major capitals per page. That is, their usage of major capitals is more or less the same. And we'd expect that. We'd expect the fit divisions to probably be determined by the exemplar, perhaps by a much older exemplar, and not to be determined by these particular scribes. So they are fairly consistent in how and when, how frequently they use fit divisions. Whereas their use of minor capitals, those smaller ones, Scribe A uses them about 3 times as often as Scribe B does. That indicates to me that the major capitals are probably determined by an exemplar, just as the form I've argued is determined by the exemplar, but the minor capitals, the placement, seems to be determined by the scribe because they're so different. Similarly, the form of minor capitals seems to be scribally determined. So we saw that Scribe A uses a different form of marginal capital O in each of his texts, but he uses the same form of minor capital G in each of his texts. So whereas he varies his major capital forms, he keeps his minor capital forms absolutely consistent. So there's evidence of the difference in his practice and Scribe B's, and the evidence that he keeps the same form suggests to me, following Claygraph's logic, that probably he is the one deciding where and how to use minor capitals, but the exemplar is the one telling him where and how to use major capitals. So what? Does it make any difference? Is it just completely random where Scribe A decides to slap in a minor capital? Is he thinking about his readers at all? This is the distribution of minor capitals through the text of Alexander's letter to Aristotle. So you've got each page along the bottom, and then the numbers of minor capitals used in those pages just as bars there. And just to look at an example of one of these pages, this is a page with 7 minor capitals on, or where I've identified 7 minor capitals, and that's where I see them. You can see they're mostly O's. You can see the first minor capital O is coloured in there a little bit randomly. You can see the second minor capital O, which is on line 8, is really quite small, and perhaps it could be questioned whether it counts or not. I've counted it, as does Stanley Rupins, who transcribes the text, as in fact did Philip Pulciano, because it follows a point. Rather than really because of its size, although it is slightly larger than other uses of O. But anyway, so where you decide minor capitals are is a little bit subjective. So you can see some pages of Alexander's letter to Aristotle have an awful lot of minor capitals littered across them. But as the graph shows, that's really quite inconsistent. Some pages have no minor capitals at all, some have 1, some have 3, some have 5, some have 6 or 7. And I can't really see any discernible or interesting pattern in this distribution. That page that I just showed you isn't a particularly exciting period. It's quite a transitional period, actually, in the letter between one event and another. There's no particular upturn in the number of capitals used at dramatic or exciting or philosophical moments of the narrative. There seems to be nothing that ties them together at all, apart from there are more used at the start and the end of the text, and there are more used at the start and the end of gatherings. So you can see, for example, about in the middle of this graph, the transition between 125 verso and then on to 110, 111, which is the end of one gathering and the start of another, which are disordered, hence the wrong numbers. You can see that there are more minor capitals being used there. So possibly Scribe A is using more minor capitals when he starts writing and more minor capitals as on the penultimate page of the text, 131 recto, when he's coming towards the end of a piece of gathering and is particularly conscious of his text, perhaps particularly conscious of trying to look impressive, trying to be spectacular and sophisticated in his presentation, but not any indication really that he's thinking about his readers or his audience. However, I think it might be a little bit different when we look at Beowulf. If we break Scribe A's copying of Beowulf down into his gatherings, he copies some of Beowulf into gatherings 5 through to 11. He starts Beowulf in gathering 5 and he breaks off 3 pages and 4 lines into gathering 11, and Scribe B takes over for the remainder of gathering 11 and for gatherings 12 and 13. And his use of major capitals throughout that stint, as we would expect, remains pretty much consistent. He uses about 1 every 3 pages. I've suggested earlier that the fits are determined by the exemplar. He's not deciding where to use them, and they occur relatively regularly, with a little bit of variation, slightly fewer in gathering 10 and slightly more in other places. However, his use of minor capitals is really quite different in 2 gatherings in particular. In gathering 5, we might expect him to be using more minor capitals based on what we saw in Alexander, because it's the first bit of writing that he does, so he litters those 4 pages of gathering 5 with more than 1 minor capital each. However, it's interesting that when we come to gathering 10, suddenly he uses an awful lot more again. He uses about 1 every 3 pages in gathering 6, 7, 8 and 9. He uses none at all in the 3 pages he copies of gathering 11, but he uses more than 1 each page in what he copies of gathering 10. And if we look in more detail at little groupings throughout the Scribe A's copying of Beowulf, there are in fact 4 short passages where across 2 pages or 4 sides Scribe A uses an awful lot of minor capitals, well above his average throughout the manuscript and well above his average for each of those gatherings. So in each of these 4-page little sequences, he uses 1.25, 1.5 or 1.75 minor capitals per page. It's not crazy, it's not loads, it's not 7, but it's significantly above his gathering average. Those last 2 there are from gathering 10, and they're largely responsible for the gathering 10's average being just over 1. So then the question is, if, as I've argued, there's something interesting about this use, and it's not just random, it's not just as whim takes him, or what his hand happens to do, then there should be some literary consistency to what those passages contain. And I think for 3 of them, there probably is. They fit fairly tightly to these sequences. The initial party in Heorot and Grendel's first invasion of the hall corresponds very closely with, well, exactly really, with the first little 4-page sequence. The celebration of Beowulf's defeat of Grendel and the shop telling the story of Siegmund and Fitela and his dragon fits the 2nd sequence. Very precisely fitted by the 4th sequence, the densest one, is Beowulf getting into Grendel's mother's cave, fighting and killing her and decapitating Grendel, and that 4-page sequence ends abruptly with the zoom out to the men standing around outside the mere. And those 3 passages seem to correspond very closely to the same kind of ideas about the eruption of men into monstrous worlds, or of monsters into men's worlds, and of conflict and violence between them. And the last passage I've identified doesn't fit that at all. It is the farewell between Hrothgar and Beowulf. So what I'm suggesting is that it seems to be the case, or it may be the case, that this denser use of minor capitals is scribally determined, is not determined by position within a gathering or within a copying of a text, unlike those in Alexander and arguably unlike those in gathering 5 of Beowulf. We might be seeing here scribal interest in these passages or his expectation of greater readerly interest, or his encouragement to a more dramatic delivery of these passages. It's been argued that punctuation and layout of different forms are used impressively. Douglas Moffat argued this, are used impressively in Vicelli's Soul and Body poem, compared with the extra book version of the same text, and that they're used there to illuminate obscure passages. There's nothing particularly obscure in any of these passages. So there doesn't seem to be any need for them to be clarifying. They are, I think, purely showing, if they're showing anything at all, they are purely showing literary interest. So that's why I've called this capital indications rather than capital certainties. I'm not proving that Scribe A is editing his texts for readers, but I think there are some suggestions, some indications that his usage of capitals gives some implications, gives some suggestions, some nudges to how his readers should engage with parts of the Nowell Codex. Thank you so much for your attention. There's my contact details. Please feel free to get in touch if you want to get any of this data from me, or any of the reading that I've done that lies behind this that I haven't talked about very much, or if you'd like to help me out by telling me where I'm wrong or telling me where I could go forward in the future. Thanks for your time.